20 years ago, I stood in my tiny apartment at 3 in the morning, staring at a stack of red envelopes piled on my kitchen table. Eviction notices, medical bills, credit card statements with numbers so high they didn't even look real anymore. My wife was asleep in the next room. She was 7 months pregnant with our second child, and I had exactly $43 in my bank account. I was a rabbi, a teacher of sacred texts, a guide for people searching for meaning in their lives, and yet I couldn't even provide the most basic security for my own family. That night, something inside me broke. I fell to my knees on that cold kitchen floor, and I cried. Not the quiet, respectful tears of prayer, but the desperate cries of a man who had run out of options, run out of hope, and honestly, run out of faith in himself. And in that moment of complete surrender, a quiet thought entered my mind. A whisper. It said, "Go back to the beginning. Go back to the words."
That I'm about to share with you is not theory. It's not some motivational speech meant to make you feel good for a few minutes. What I discovered in the months that followed that night completely changed my life. Today I own 3 businesses worth more than $8 million combined. I employ dozens of people. My family lives in abundance. But more importantly, we live in peace. And here's the most important part. The principles that changed my life had nothing to do with luck. They were written thousands of years ago, right there in the sacred scriptures, waiting for anyone brave enough to actually apply them. I discovered 13 verses that completely transformed the way I saw work, money, and abundance. And those verses didn't just make me wealthier, they made me wiser. They made me whole. But before we go further, let me take you back to that dark season in my life. Because I need you to understand something important.
I had been serving my community faithfully for years. I studied hard. I gave advice to people. I showed up for every wedding, every funeral, every moment when someone needed guidance. But somewhere along the way, I absorbed a dangerous belief. I believed that spirituality and wealth were opposites. I believed that if you were truly holy, you had to struggle financially. I looked at wealthy people in my community and silently judged them. I told myself they were too focused on material things. Meanwhile, my car kept breaking down. My children wore hand-me-down clothes. My wife worked double shifts while I convinced myself our suffering was somehow noble. Then one day, something happened that shattered that illusion. My daughter needed medicine from the pharmacy. The cost was $70. When the cashier ran my card, it was declined. $70. I stood there while people waited behind me in line. The pharmacist gave me that look. You know the look. The look of quiet pity. I walked out to the parking lot and sat in my dying car. And I asked myself one question. If God is the source of all abundance, if Scripture says He provides, if these promises are real, then why am I living like He forgot me? There were only 2 possible answers. Either the promises were not true, or I was missing something. That night I went into my study and opened my scriptures again. But this time I wasn't reading like a rabbi preparing a sermon. I was reading like a desperate man searching for a map out of the wilderness. And what I discovered shocked me. The scriptures are full of wisdom about money, work, planning, and prosperity. Not hidden, not secret, right there in plain sight. But most of us have been taught to treat these verses like metaphors instead of instructions. So I started making a list. Every verse about wealth, about work, about planning, about generosity. But 13 verses stood out above all the others. Together, they formed a powerful framework for living in alignment with abundance. And when I began applying those principles, slowly, carefully, everything started changing. Within 6 months, I had paid off half my debt. Within 1 year, I started my first business. Within 2 years, it earned more than my salary as a rabbi. And within 5 years, I had built multiple successful ventures. But the most surprising thing was this. The wealthier I became, the more spiritual my life became. because poverty had been distracting me. Poverty had been whispering lies, lies that God didn't care, lies that I was forgotten. But those lies disappeared when I started applying wisdom. Let me show you the first verse that changed everything. It comes from Proverbs. Lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. When I truly understood this verse, I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't being as diligent as I thought. I was doing my job, but I wasn't doing my best work. So I changed my mindset. Every task became an opportunity for excellence, and people started noticing. Opportunities began appearing that had never appeared before. The second verse changed my mindset about ability. It says, "Remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth." This verse reminded me that our skills are gifts. Every idea, every opportunity, every talent, they are abilities given to us. So every morning, I started thanking God for the abilities I had. And that simple practice changed how I saw my life. Instead of feeling powerless, I started seeing opportunities everywhere. The third principle was the hardest. It came from Proverbs again. Honor the Lord with your wealth and the first fruits of your income. At that time, I barely had money to survive. But I made a decision. I would give 10% of everything I earned. Even when it didn't make sense, and something incredible happened. Opportunities began appearing. Unexpected income, new connections, new doors. Because generosity changes how you interact with the world. Another powerful verse says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to profit." I realized faith alone wasn't enough. I needed strategy. So I started writing real goals, clear financial plans, business ideas, and I prayed over those plans. That's when ideas started flowing. Another verse taught me patience. Wealth gained quickly will disappear, but wealth gathered little by little will grow. In a world obsessed with fast success, this verse reminded me that real wealth is built slowly, step by step. Another verse gave me powerful financial wisdom. Invest in 7 ventures, yes in 8, because you do not know what disaster may come. In other words, don't rely on one income stream. Diversify, build multiple opportunities. Another verse changed my relationship with debt. The borrower is slave to the lender. That line hit me like lightning. So I made it my mission to become completely debt-free. It took years, but the freedom was worth it. Another principle was awareness. Know the condition of your flocks. Today we would say, know your numbers. Track your money. Understand your finances. Another verse taught me about planting seeds. You cannot harvest what you never planted. So I started investing in learning, relationships, and growth. Another verse taught generosity. A generous person will prosper. And I have seen this truth again and again. The more you help others succeed, the more success flows back into your life. Another verse taught surrender. Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will succeed. Every day I began my work with prayer. And finally, one last verse kept me grounded. Whoever loves money will never have enough, because wealth is not the goal. Purpose is. These 13 verses completely transformed my life. Not overnight, but steadily. If you apply them with discipline and faith, they can transform your life too. And one day, you may look back at this moment as the moment everything began to change.